Well, good afternoon for most of us. And we've got so many attendees today that we've got kind of a global audience here. So for some of you, it might be morning, and some of you, it might be evening. So welcome to the webinar today. Thanks for being with us. First things first, my name is Amy Omang. I'm with the ASPA staff. I'm going to be the facilitator today. And before I introduce our moderator and our guests today, just a couple things primarily about the audio-visual and some technical aspects here. So what you see on your screen, you've got a control panel on your screen, and you can take note of a couple icons there. If you click the orange arrow, that's going to open and close the larger control panel, depending on your preferences. And then you also have a green circle with a square inside. That lets you adjust your viewer mode between a full screen and partial mode. There is also, on that larger control panel, there is a questions pane. And a couple things about this. We'll have some chance for engagement with our moderator and guests today. So if you have questions or comments that occur to you at any time, please feel free to type them into that questions pane. And our moderator will address them at the appropriate time, if we do have time. We've got some great material here, so we're going to try to make some time for that as well. And then if you have any technical issues, this is also a place where you can chat with me on the back end through that questions panel, and I'll work with you directly. Okay, so let's get on to the meat of the program here. Want to introduce John Kamensky. He's been a great partner with us in many ways, and he today, of course, was responsible for bringing this content to us with the help of CAP, the Center for Accountability and Performance. So big thank you to John once again. It's been a really great partner with our webinar series. John is a senior fellow with the IBM Center for the Business of Government, and during over 2 decades of public service, he's had a significant role in helping pioneer the federal government's performance and results orientation. While at several agencies, he's been at the Government Accountability Office, the Office of Management and Budget, and the National Partnership for Reinventing Government, to name a few. Also has edited or co-authored many books, writes and speaks extensively on performance management and government reform, and we are very happy to have him here today. So welcome, John.
Well, thank you very much, Amy, and I'm really pleased to be able to moderate this session. A few months ago, Professor Donald Moynihan shared with me an advanced copy of a book that he and others co-authors had put together around the use of behavioral public performance, and I was very intrigued by it, and the book was fascinating. I said, when can you talk to a broader audience about this? He says, well, let's wait until it's published, and the book is now out. It was just released just this past week or so. So there's been this revolution in measurement and reporting of government performance. And we've talked about in the past the use of metrics and scorecards and league tables and rankings. But, you know, this has swept the globe, but it's not always had the kind of impact that the inventors had intended. And Don Moynihan and his other authors said, well, there's this other revolution that's going on in public administration around the use of behavioral science. And he says that may help inform why performance information is or isn't used in ways that were envisioned by policymakers. So today, Dr. Moynihan and Dr. Gregg van Ryzin will share their insights from this new released book, which you can see the cover on over here on the left. And they co-authored it with Dr. Oliver James at the University of Exeter and Dr. Asmus Olsen, who's at the University of Copenhagen. In their presentation and subsequent discussion, Don and Gregg will reveal a bit about how people interpret and make sense of government performance metrics. And they'll talk a bit about the characteristics of numbers, how you can subtly frame information to make it more understandable, the choices of benchmarks or comparisons, how do you motivate human understanding and actions, and just basically the kinds of information sources that influence the interpretation and the use of metrics. This is all much more granular and interpretive than has traditionally been used in the performance measurement world. And I think this will strongly enhance what's been going on in the future in the design and practice of government performance reporting. A little bit about Don Moynihan. He's relatively new here in Washington, D.C. as the inaugural McCourt Chair at the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University. His academic research over his career has been focused on how to improve how government works. Most recently, he's been examining behavioral effects of efforts to improve public sector outcomes, as well as the administrative burdens that people encounter in their interaction with government. His research on public sector performance has informed policymakers at the U.S. Office of Management Budget, at the World Bank, the OECD in Paris, as well as governments around the world. He's written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Hill, and a lot of other national venues. And he's also an entertaining Twitter user. So follow him on Twitter if you want to have a very interesting stream of insights. He's been awarded twice the Joe Holy Award for the best written journal articles on performance management by ASPA's Center for Accountability and Performance. He's also a fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration. His co-presenter today, Gregg Van Ryzin, is a professor in the School of Public Affairs and Administration at Rutgers University in Newark, New Jersey. His research work uses experimental and behavioral approaches to a range of issues in public administration, including performance measurement, evaluation, citizen satisfaction, and trust in government, as well as looking at co-production of public services and representative bureaucracy. He's co-authored a textbook, Research Methods and Practice, and co-edited a textbook, Experiments in Public Management Research. He's also a founding editor of the new Journal of Behavioral Public Administration, which I recommend highly as a very interesting new journal. And he's also a co-editor of International Public Management Journal. He was recently inducted as a fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration. The agenda for today is Dr. Moynihan will begin the presentation by providing an overview of the book's Behavioral Public Performance Framework. And then he and Dr. Van Ryzin will then build on that context by providing insights on several different types of behavioral science. Amy Omang has shared copies of their PowerPoint presentations with you already if you're just dialing in and can't see the screen. But follow on the screen if you can. And then after their presentations, we'll take some of the questions from you. We won't have time to deal with all of them, but we may be able to come back now. And you can submit them either online or via email, as Amy's explained. At this point, I'd like to turn the forum over to Dr. Moynihan.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. It's wonderful that we can still find time to get together in what is difficult time. As John mentioned, we are shilling a book today. This is a book we just completed, but we're better at writing books than marketing. So the book's not actually available at this point, but it should be coming out any day now. And there is a link at the end of the presentation where you can buy it. Can we jump to the next slide? As John mentioned, this is a transatlantic effort. Our co-authors are Oliver James at Exeter and Asmus Olsen at Copenhagen. I had the good fortune of being in Oxford last year, and so we spent a good chunk of last year finishing the book and finally getting it out. Next slide, please. So Gregg and I will jump across a variety of topics that come from the book. So to give you a sense of what's coming up, we'll sort of talk about why people use information, what sort of frames or biases they have when they use information, and are there ways to actually make it more likely that they'll use performance data in a way that's helpful for public services. Next slide. As John mentioned, we were motivated by this idea that there's two revolutions. Next slide. And the two revolutions that are occurring at the same time that we were both a little bit involved in. One is there's this revolution in government where There's more emphasis on performance data, dashboards, scorecards. If you work in government, you're familiar with this. The second is partly from the world of academia, the behavioral science revolution, where there's this strong focus on understanding human judgment and decision making. So if you are familiar with the book Nudge or Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, those are two examples of leading contributions in this work. And a lot of the research that emerges from this behavioral science approach is the research design that we use in the book we're going to talk about today. That is to say, we used randomized control experiments where we try to understand the effects of some sort of treatment versus a control group by comparing how the treated group differs in some behavioral fashion from the control group. Next slide. To help make sense of all of this, we have this general behavioral public performance framework that we outline in the opening chapter of the book. And that the basic argument here is that the outcomes we're interested in, and those are things like the judgment, expectations, decisions of policymakers, the public, or public officials, are a function of three big factors when it comes to behavioral public performance. One is how people are given the data, so the nature of the data itself. The second is the individual's characteristics, including their numerical ability and underlying bias. The third is the environmental context in which they work. And it's the combination of those three things that generates the outcomes we're going to talk about. Next slide. So let me start by asking what's in a performance number. Next slide. And we start with the sort of unfortunate conclusion that people say they prefer statistical information to make decisions. So if you survey the public and you ask them if you had to make a decision about, say, which hospital to choose, you had an operation, or which school to send your kid to, people know what the socially correct answer is, which is that you would get some good performance data or some statistical information and make a judgment based on that. But some of the work that our co-author Asmus has done has combined quantitative information and anecdotal information, and has found that people are more responsive to anecdotal information. That is, they find that information more memorable, more emotionally engaging, and more influential when it comes to their decisions. Next slide. So what's the implication of this point? We think the sort of big practical point is that the human brain is not hardwired for numbers. We are instead more attentive to stories. And so if you want people to to pay attention to numbers, you have to put those numbers in the context of a broader story. One thing we talk about in our book is an example of this from the government of New Zealand, where they tell stories about public sector programs, in this case a welfare program, through the lens of an individual beneficiary, using videos, using images, and then embed the numbers within that broader story. We think this is a more likely way to get people engaged in performance metrics. Next slide. Another lesson of the book is that we're not always good with quantitative performance indicators because we have certain biases in how we interpret information. One of the biggest is something called left digit bias. We focus on the first digit of a number, so we pay attention to the first thing we see, and we tend to pay less attention to anything after that, even if that's still quite significant. And that's the reason why if you go to a store, if you could still go to a store, people will be selling you products for $4.99 or $9.99, right? They're trying to keep the number below some symbolic threshold of $5 or $10 that you find to be compelling. We know, for example, looking at the sales of lottery tickets, that they tend to have these huge increases in sales when they go above one of these thresholds. So if you go from 99 million to 100 million of a lottery size, sales of tickets can rise by about 20 times as much. So an example of how this matters for performance data is that with our left digit bias, we have something closer to a step function when it comes to the relationship between the performance data that we're given and how we interpret that performance. So ideally, we'd have this interpretation where each incremental increase in performance causes us to update our belief about the quality of performance. So a straight line between performance data and our impressions. But in reality, we have this something more akin to a step function. And on the right-hand side of the image, you can see that example in practice, where people are asked to make judgments about schools where the average performance score of students is, in one case, between 5 to 5.4 and 5.5 to 5.9. And the message from this graph is that people don't really distinguish differences in performance when you move from 5.0 to 5.4 to a higher increment of 5.5 to 5.9. It's not until you jump across the threshold of 6 that people upgrade their evaluation of the quality of the school. So jumping from 5.9 to 6 has a significant impact in your evaluation of the quality of performance, but you tend to discount anything after the decimal point. Next slide. So one solution to the problem of left digit bias is to use graphs. There's a more general issue of how we frame information, and this is where I'm going to hand over to Gregg to talk about framing of performance data.
Okay, thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Gregg Van Ryzin, and this chapter of the book focuses on frames. All information is framed in some way, and it turns out that, in the same way that a picture is framed, and sometimes that can influence how we see and interpret the picture, numbers are framed, and the way in which they're framed can influence the judgments we make about metrics and quantitative information. And some examples that we cover in the chapter are something called equivalence framing. You can, frame things as in a positive way or a negative way, sort of the glass is half full or half empty, that kind of idea. That can be applied to numbers, and there is a choice about how to frame the numbers. And we'll talk a little bit about negativity bias, which is the fact that people respond to negative information in a stronger way often than to positive information. And some studies we did on rates and ratios, which are used often in government statistics, and that's a way of sort of framing the information that also turns out to influence judgments. So next slide, please. So the results that you're looking at here come from a study that ASPA Olsen did in Denmark, and what you can see here is the difference in the way people respond to positively framed information and negatively framed information. The context here is people's satisfaction with their experience of a visit to a hospital, and when people are told or told about that information or presented that information in the form of the percent of people who are satisfied with the hospital's care versus the percent of people who are dissatisfied with the hospital care, you can see sort of a difference in the response curve. So the positively framed information leads to higher evaluations of the hospital and its performance, and the negatively framed information leads to the sort of lower evaluation scores as judged by sort of the people interpreting that information. So that's an example of how positive and negative framing can shape or influence the way people judge the information. So next slide, please. And I think this is a study that Don did, so he'll explain this one, right?
Sorry, what Gregg just presented to you was an example of equivalence framing. This is another way in which negativity bias emerges, which is when people are given performance data that shows worse outcomes, they tend to be more responsive to that when they're given performance data that shows more positive outcomes. So there are a couple of studies that demonstrate this. One study that I ran with elected officials in Denmark looked at their willingness to attribute responsibility for performance outcomes of managers. and they tended to be much more willing, and this is what the bar chart shows, to allocate responsibility to managers when performance was lower. So they tended to be more responsive to that negative information. We also have some evidence from the UK that political incumbents tend to get punished when their local governments are evaluated as performing poorly, but they don't see any equivalent gain when their local governments are evaluated as performing well. So the point of negativity bias is that we're generally more responsive to bad news and low performance scores or performance data that's framed as negative information, and less responsive to positive information. So I'll go back to Gregg as we move to the next slide.
So I mentioned that one of the forms of framing information, particularly with government statistics, is the reporting of rates and ratios. And that's very important, for example, with health statistics, disease rates, or crime rates. And in an experiment that I ran with Oliver James, we presented the actual crime statistics, but we changed the way in which the rate of crime was being presented to people. So the way that FBI typically presents it is sort of in the middle of the chart there, the 400 per 100,000 rate. That's the actual rate of violent crime at the time that we did this experiment. We rounded the numbers up very slightly just to make it a little bit clearer. But we tried framing that same information in different types of rates and ratios. And governments have a choice when they report statistics on what they pick as the base number and what kinds of rates they present and publish to the public. And we found out, interestingly, that the very same rate of crime, if it's presented in different formats, influences the perceived risk of crime in the society. And so what you can see, the call-out bubbles show that if you frame crime as 4,000 cases of reports of violent crime per 1 million people versus 4 cases of violent crime per 1,000 people, mathematically those are the same. But you can see that the perceived risk of the higher, bigger numbers is seen as leads to a higher level of perceived risk. And that's partly because people are focusing on the magnitude of the numerator and obviously doing the mental math and calculating the ratio. We don't really respond to ratios. We respond often to just the pure magnitude of the number. So that's an interesting example of how framing the exact same information in different forms can influence how we perceive a risk in society. Or so next slide, please. So another chapter in the book deals with comparisons. Next slide, please. Comparisons are really important for performance measurement, as many of you know, that a performance metric doesn't really mean much unless it's in the context of some kind of comparison. How are you doing compared to another organization, or how's your organization doing compared to where it was a year ago? And there are different kinds of comparisons. There's comparisons with past performance, which are sometimes called historical comparisons. There are comparisons with another jurisdiction or organization. Those are sometimes referred to as social comparisons. And then there are comparisons with goals or targets that you've set for the program or the organization. But it turns out that these kinds of comparisons influence our thinking in sometimes unexpected ways. So next slide, please. So one example is, this comes from a study that Asmus Olsen did, where he looked at historical comparisons versus social comparisons. And it's, again, the exact same information is being presented, the relative sort of performance of the, in this case, it's school performance, the relative performance of a school compared to where it was last year. And that was experimentally varied. And you can see that, with the more you do better than you did last year, the higher the evaluations of the school performance. And that's a historical comparison. But what's interesting, next slide, is that the very same performance in the context of a social comparison, there's the graph for the social comparison, is a much stronger relationship. So if you do better relative to another school, people sort of judge that as being a more important improvement than if you do better than you did the year before. And that's kind of interesting. It sort of shows that we're very sensitive to social comparisons, maybe more so than we are in, sensitive to kind of comparisons over time. The next slide, please.
Thanks, Greg. So this is the a sort of takeaway point on the comparisons point, is that we generally as human beings find comparisons compelling and engaging, and they draw us in. And so one experiment I ran looked at how invested school principals were in downloading performance data. And so we sent a letter to the school principals, told them if you went on this website, you could download this performance information about your school. And then we monitored how much information they actually downloaded. For some of those school principals, we made comparative information available. So they got information not just about their schools and the performance of classes in their schools, but they also got information about nearby schools. And what we found was that when you gave that comparative information, school principals downloaded much more information overall, about a third more performance data. So it had this really large effect on their investment in seeking out performance information. Next slide. As we talk about comparisons, it's important to think through all of the ways they can encourage people to invest in performance information, but also sometimes ways in which comparisons might lead us astray. And so one example of this is anchoring effects. This is a well-established psychological bias that we have, which is that if you give someone a number, that sort of cues them to think about all the additional information you give them afterwards in a different way. So a way to illustrate this point about anchoring effects is an experiment that comes from Italy, where actual public personnel employees were given a hypothetical file about an individual with information about their performance for the last year, and they were asked to evaluate the quality of the performance of that individual. And the files were exactly the same. The only difference was that some of the people were told out of 100, this person scored 51 out of 100 last year, or they were told this person scored 91 out of 100 last year, but you should only evaluate them based on the information in front of you. Those numbers provided an anchor that didn't cause the personnel officials to look at the files differently. So the people who had gotten the low anchor tended to give much lower scores to the hypothetical individual, a 71 out of 100. People who got the high anchor, the 91 score from last year, tended to give scores that were very similar to that, 88 out of 100. So back to Greg to talk about motivated reasoning.
Okay, yeah, so motivated reasoning is another chapter in the book, and there's been a lot of interesting work done on that in psychology, and we kind of adapt some of those ideas to looking at how people interpret performance information. So motivated reasoning is basically the idea that we're not neutral when we interpret quantitative or statistical information, that we actually often have motivations that influence the way we select what to pay attention to, the way we interpret it, the way we process data. And often we do that in a way that attempts to try to confirm or fit with pre-existing beliefs that we have. We don't always do that. I mean, sometimes we have accuracy motives that lead us to be more objective in our evaluation of the information, but often other motivations come into play, like we want to confirm things that we already believe are true. And in particular, looking at when we think about government performance, partisan motivated reasoning or political motivations often influence the way we interpret information. And so, next slide, please. So, along with Oliver James, we ran a study a couple of years ago in which we presented people with information about the Affordable Care Act in the United States, and this was a national sample of people, the general public in the United States, and we showed them some real dashboard kind of information, an array of indicators about the Affordable Care Act. And some of the indicators pointed to good news about the Affordable Care Act. Other indicators pointed to bad news about it. And of course, the Affordable Care Act has been very political in the United States. And so we were interested sort of in the partisan differences between how people would assess that information. But we did something experimentally, which is for half the sample, we primed them to think about their need for healthcare. So we asked them basically a set of questions about their concerns about their health, whether they were covered with insurance or not, whether they had concerns about access to healthcare. So that one group got a sort of an initial set of questions that got them to think more about their actual need for healthcare, and the other group was primed more about their political views. So we asked a set of standard questions about whether their beliefs about whether they consider themselves liberal or conservative, whether they believe government is too strong a role or not enough of a role, and basically kind of got them to think more in political terms. And then when we showed them the information, what was interesting is that the Democrats and the Republicans, as you can see on the left-hand side of the graph, when they were primed to think about their healthcare needs, their choice of the information to pay attention to was much more similar in terms of its positivity and negativity. So that's why those two dots over the left-hand side of the graph are close together, because both Democrats and Republicans kind of picked information that was a little more maybe neutral and more based on their actual interest in healthcare outcomes. When we primed them first to think about their political views, they made much different choices. The Democrats gravitated more towards positive indicators about the Affordable Care Act, and the Republicans gravitated towards more negative indicators about the Affordable Care Act. So that's a kind of an interesting result that shows that the way that people choose what information to focus on and to pay attention to can sometimes be driven by their motivations, whether those are motivations to find out about healthcare or motivations to confirm prior political beliefs. Next slide. I think that's back to Don, right?
Yep. So this is another experiment that sort of takes this a step further. And this is an experiment that was run with elected officials. And we wanted to see how the sort of motivated reasoning Gregg was talking about affects people's judgment and whether they'd actually make incorrect decisions. And so in this experiment, the setup was that people were given information about schools, and they were given information about a public school and a private school, and they were asked to sort of make a judgment about which school was performing better. And they had to do some basic math to calculate the answer, but there was an objectively correct answer. So in some cases, the public school was objectively performing better. In some cases, the private school was. So there was a test there on their ability to get that question right. And the researchers also asked about people's preferences for public or private services. And so what this graph shows you is how often people get the numbers right. And what's really interesting is that sort of right-hand part of the chart, where people who are grouped by their support for public services, when they have very high support for public services, and the answer to the objective test of performance data is the public school is the best school, they get the answer right about 9 times out of 10. So when their motivated reasoning or their ideological beliefs match up with the data, they tend to be right almost all of the time. But when the private school performs better, the people who believe in public services tend to get the answer wrong about half of the time. And so this shows a huge effect on the role of motivated reasoning in judgment and in the use of performance metrics. So next slide, please. Back to Gregg.
Okay, so another topic we cover in the book is sources of information. Of course, all information comes from some kind of source, and it turns out that the sources of information influence our thinking about it. So people get information about government from the news, they get it from social media, official sources like government websites and government reports, but also informally from word of mouth and so on. And the chapter covers a little bit about, in descriptive terms, where people actually get their information. And a lot of it comes from more informal sources and formal sources. But in particular, what I'm about to show you is some research we did on whether the government reporting on itself, when the government is the source, in other words, it's an official source, versus a more external or independent source, how that influences people's thinking, because that's a major issue, obviously, in performance reporting. So this graph that you see here comes from an experiment we ran in the United States with a sample of U.S. adults, and we reported on some real information about customer satisfaction with federal agencies. And it turns out that an independent organization called the American Customer Satisfaction Index, that's the ACSI, measures carefully and reports on customer satisfaction with various federal agencies, the IRS, the Postal Service, the Veterans Administration, and so on. And we took a kind of a couple of those different agencies, and we presented people with customer satisfaction scores when we said that the information was coming from the independent source, the American Customer Satisfaction Index, and then we also presented the same information as coming from the agency itself, like the IRS or the Veterans Administration. And that's actually realistic, because these federal agencies contract with the American Customer Satisfaction Index to measure their customer satisfaction, and the agencies do report their own customer satisfaction, as well as the ACSI doing it on its own. And then we varied whether the satisfaction scores were relatively low, kind of in the 80s, or relatively high, kind of in the 90s, 90% satisfaction versus sort of satisfaction levels in the 80%. I won't go into too many details about that, but what you can see in the graph, which is kind of interesting, is the reason the lines cross is that when the darker line is the lower scores, you can see that when the scores are lower, the satisfaction scores are in the 80s. When the agency is reporting on itself, people believe the agency. But when the scores are higher in the 90s, people are less likely to believe the agency reporting on itself. And so, just to kind of say that again, that when the information is relatively positive, scores that are in the 90s, the agency reporting on itself tends to not be believed. But when the agency is reporting relatively lower scores, the government agency reporting on itself tends to be believed more. And that's kind of interesting, we think, because it suggests that when, in the performance movement, it's often suggested that governments should try to earn trust and credibility by reporting on their performance, and when they're reporting that they're doing well, that should lead to more kind of, legitimacy and trust. But it seems that people don't find the information as credible when the agency is reporting good news on its performance. So the next slide, please. And the next slide illustrates essentially the same thing that Oliver James replicated in a different context with e-government ratings. And you can see when the national government is reporting on its own e-government ratings, those three means indicate the extent to which the information is seen as valid, honest, and helpful. And you can see that when the UN is reporting on the e-government performance of nations, that information is believed more because the UN is more of an external independent source. When the government is reporting on itself, and this was both the UK government reporting on itself and the Netherlands reporting on itself, people found the information to be less honest, less helpful. They believed it was less valid. Next slide.
So this is the last couple of slides of the presentation. So one of the sort of takeaway points we have from the book is that governments have gotten quite good at producing information and even disseminating information, but not always in terms of thinking about using information. And so one suggestion we have from a practical point of view is that governments should think about developing what we call learning forums, what are also sometimes called data-driven reviews, but basically building up routines within the organization where a group of people sit around and try to make sense of the data. And there's some good behavioral reasons why we think this will make a difference. One is that it directs attention towards performance data. And so if left to themselves, people aren't necessarily going to pull out performance information, but if they've established a routine, they're more likely to do so. The second is that some of the individual biases we talked about today are more likely to be checked in a group context. So if you have to talk about performance and justify your interpretation of performance, you might be more likely to either check yourself or have other people question your judgment to avoid some of those biases. There are some behavioral lessons that we talk about to try and minimize some of the potentially negative aspects of these learning forums. So one experiment tried to look at how changing the tone or changing the expectation about tone mattered to people. So in the experiment, individuals were asked to prepare a memo for either someone who was an elected official or a peer, and to think about that memo as the basis for discussion in a group context. And what they found was that when you were asked to prepare the memo for the elected official, you tended to be much more guarded, less likely to admit mistakes, less likely to draw attention to errors. And this points to the potential that people will sort of censor themselves if they feel like the learning forum will become a basis by which they are going to be punished. One other sort of takeaway point that reflects negativity bias is that these learning forums can work well if they take opportunities to engage in problem solving. So to try to identify negative outliers before they become failures or scandal and deal with them at earlier stages. Next slide. The final point we want to emphasize is the role of autonomy. And so there's this well-established claim in public management research that people are more likely to use performance data to make a decision when they have some administrative discretion to do so. And it sort of makes sense, right? If you have no power and no ability to change anything, why spend time trying to interpret and make sense of performance data? We ran another experiment. So again, I ran this experiment with school principals and the Department of Education in Denmark, where we looked at school principals who were given more freedom in how they could hire individuals. And they tended to hire people with different backgrounds when given a little bit more autonomy. And then again, we tried to test if they downloaded more performance data. And it did seem that when people had more freedom to make decisions, they were more interested in pulling together performance data. And so there's some implications there about trying to have discussions about performance at a place where you have authority to actually make decisions, or to at least get people to the table who have that authority when you're having those discussions. And in terms of tone, trying to frame some of these changes as not as sort of reforms that will last forever, but as experiments where you're willing to acknowledge there can be failures. Next slide. So we are going to wrap up here. We have some time for questions. I have been informed that the book will be available from next week. So if you check back next week, next slide, please. I think we can probably send out a copy of the link to the book again, but there is a copy to it here. So if you're interested in this, it's a fairly short book. They're intended to be user-friendly, short chapters, not incredibly academic, but hopefully providing some of the new research on this topic in a way that's accessible to a broader practitioner public. I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you both, Don and Greg, for your wonderful presentation. It's really rich information, and it adds a nuance to the use of performance information that has not been traditional in this field. It'll be, I think, useful to look at how this can be used by performance people in agencies, evaluators, policy staffs, etc. The key thing for many years was how do you get performance measures used, and you bring in not just how do you get them used, but how do you get them used properly? And I think that's something that comes across in your book and the different experiments that you use to demonstrate the different concepts in behavioral science that are reflected in your book. Just a quick question for you, and then I'll turn to some of those that are on the screen here. Have you seen the use of behavioral science in this COVID phase that we're in now? I mean, we have obviously bad news, and is that being used, for example, to encourage people to stay at home? And people are now learning statistical terms like flatten the curve and percent of population covered, et cetera. So are you seeing, just from the experiments that you reflect in your book, are you seeing in the real world those kinds of concepts being applied?
So I'll answer quickly, and then Gregg can jump in. I think one of the things that Gregg talked about was denominator neglect, and I very much think that's part of how people are processing information about this crisis. So when people, you'll often hear people sort of talk about maybe 1% or only 2% fatality rate, which sounds low as a percentage, but then when you look at the nominal numbers, is an absolutely massive number of people. And there's sort of a disjuncture between people's ability to think about this in terms of nominal numbers versus these ratios. I think there's also been some efforts by behavioral scientists to think about communication techniques that make people more attentive to information and the right tone to set. But that's probably varied quite a bit from one country to the next.
John Bryson is on the line, and he's asked, what are the implications of your work for managers that need to interact with elected officials regarding performance, such as city council members or elected members, representatives in state government?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think some of our studies that we report on in the book are specifically about sort of how managers and politicians interpret information. I think actually more work needs to be done in that area. A lot of the studies we reported on, we just told you about. A lot of those are more general public samples, general citizen samples. But there is an interesting interplay between public managers and politicians in terms of how they share information and the extent to which they trust each other and how they interpret each other's motives and that sort of thing. But actually, I think Don's done more work in that area.
Yeah, I think there's probably sort of two big lessons, and thanks for the question, John. One is that elected officials have a lot of freedom and they can change their mind if they want. And so if you want consistency in the use of performance data, it's important to try and get visible commitment to certain performance metrics ahead of time, because what we find from some of our experiments is that elected officials will sort of shop around for the performance metrics that make their preferred policy outcome look best if you give them the freedom to do that. So I think, again, going back maybe to some of the work on the Affordable Care Act, if you can get elected officials to agree, here are the 5 metrics by which we're going to judge if this policy is a success or not, at time 1, then at time 2, you simply remind them that this is what we agreed to and this is what we committed to. I think the sort of second big lesson when you're communicating with elected officials is the one about tone, which is if they are going to use performance data in a sort of a star chamber fashion where they're imposing penalties and costs on people and employees interpret it as a star chamber experiment, what happens then is you get this very defensive response from managers and employees where they stop cooperating with the process. And so the more helpful tone is if elected officials want to be engaged with this, think about this as a learning opportunity and experience rather than as something that is the opportunity to allocate blame. That's easier said than done, but you can at least communicate the cost to elected officials of them using this as a blame assignment exercise.
Okay. And then we have from Mordu Seri Kamal a question about if in some organizations performance evaluations are based on past productive performance, how can the organizations improve objectively the performance of their employees going forward in the future?
So I think the implication of the anchoring bias experiment we talked about is that there's an obligation on the part of supervisors to really try to set aside those previous performance scores and to take seriously the idea that you're evaluating people on what you say you're evaluating them on, which is how they've done in the last 6 months or 1 year or however long a period you're talking about. And so I think it's helpful just to be aware of that bias. If you're a supervisor, I used to supervise employees at the last university that I worked, and it was always helpful to sort of keep this research in the back of my mind, so I wasn't just defaulting into judging someone based on how they'd done in prior years, as opposed to the material that I had in front of me.
Well, there's a question from Mark Busso, who's at the U.S. Office of Management and Budget, and he's asked is that the U.S. performance framework, GPRA, relies heavily on public reporting by government agencies, but you point out that this doesn't necessarily lead to improve perceptions, even if the data is positive. Do you know if there's any other countries that have accounted for this by establishing a third party or trusted intermediary to create more trusted public reporting?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think that in the paper where we talk about the source bias and the way in which kind of independent sources seem to be trusted more, particularly when they're presenting good performance, whereas government agencies that are reporting good performance on their own activities tend to be distrusted more. I mean, I think one of the implications of that is the creation of some kind of independent institutions to do the reporting. And I don't know in the federal context if any thought has been given to how to structure that so that agencies are not seen as reporting their kind of their own internal information, but there's more of a kind of an independent body that's the source of the evaluation. I mean, Don, you've done obviously a lot of work on that. Do you know if thought's been given to kind of how those government performance reports are being issued and by whom?
I think this is the research that you've presented, Greg, sort of points to this as a new opportunity. One of the realities that we constantly encounter is that most members of the public just are not super interested in performance data, except for functions that they experience in their everyday lives. And so it may make more sense to think about this less as a communication problem to the general public and more as a communication or framing issue to the stakeholders who care intensely about that particular service or program. But I don't know that we have an obvious answer here, except if you have really good news, it makes sense to have some trusted third party partner with you to tell that good performance news. But if you have really poor news, then it turns out people will definitely trust you if you tell them that yourself.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I have seen is, like in Baltimore, the city reported its own performance information, and it was about largely outputs. What were they, like potholes filled or whatever? And there was a community group that did an assessment of what was going on in the community, and they used a different lens. It was more the impact on citizens, and they came across as more dissatisfied. So an outside group may actually use a different frame of reference for making an assessment.
Yeah.
So that could be an interesting alternative. But I haven't seen other countries that have used a third party to make assessments. So that's a good question.
And I do know some other countries have a kind of national statistical office that maintains a certain kind of reputation and independence, and that's responsible for most of the government reporting. But in the United States is very fragmented across the different agencies, and I think particularly with the government performance reports, they tend to come from the agencies themselves. So that might be a kind of a problem with our approach.
Okay. Well, we're getting to the top of the hour, and there's a number of other questions that are in the question box. Maybe you can visit them separately afterwards and respond to the people that are asking them. And there's some good questions too. So I want to thank both of you for this terrific presentation. I found that you've had over a couple hundred people that have joined the call, and they pretty much stuck to it through the entire hour. Let me turn this back over to Amy, and Amy, you can help wrap us up.
Sure. Excuse me. Thank you. Yep. So I'm going to echo that. Thank you, Greg and Don. We really appreciate your expertise here, and just remind everybody that the book is out. So you should see on your screen there how to access it. And again, as John mentioned, there are many good questions here. We will follow up with you after the fact and with our presenters so that they can see your questions and follow up as applicable. The session is also recorded, and I've had several questions from people asking about the recording. It is available to ASPA members on our site, and you'll also see instructions on how to access that in the follow-up email. So, and thanks again to everybody for their time. Again, these are kind of strange situations these days, and hopefully people are finding silver linings. And we want to make sure that everybody stays connected. So this is a great way to do that. You're going to see an evaluation as we exit the screen. Please, it should only take a moment to complete it. We ask you to please do so. We do try to answer all questions and follow up on suggestions, and we appreciate your feedback. So wishing everyone a great rest of the afternoon or evening. Take care and stay safe. Thanks, John.
Okay, take care.
Bye-bye.